What a surprise. And what a shock for Mary as she got to the tomb that morning and found that the stone had been rolled away. And the experience of Mary finding that Jesus was no longer there, running to tell the other disciples, I don't know what on earth has happened on this morning, but something strange has happened. Jesus is no longer in the tomb. And just typical men who don't believe women. The two disciples decide to go and find out for themselves, not confident that Mary was perhaps hallucinating that morning. Perhaps even her own grief, they believed that perhaps what they had thought that she had seen, she did not. And it says that those two disciples, I always love this story because it shows that male competition that goes on so often. It says the two male disciples were running to the tomb and one outran the other. They couldn't get there together. One outran the other. And they got to the tomb, and it says that the one disciple went in and saw, it says actually that they saw that the linens were placed there, but he was too afraid to go in. And then the other disciple who goes on in and finds that Jesus' body is gone. It's true. Later in the scripture it says that Mary returned and went in and found the linen strips laying where the body had been. And then suddenly, if she wasn't freaked out enough by everything that had happened that morning, it says suddenly there were two angels stood where the place where Jesus was in gleaming white. I'm sure perhaps she was thinking, this cannot be happening. This cannot be real. Even though everything in her body and everything that Jesus had spoken about for those years of ministry were now coming to fulfillment, still she had trouble believing that her son, her babe, was truly the child of God, was truly Messiah. And so she has a conversation with these angels. And it says very clearly that in the midst of this, as she looked away and as she looked back, suddenly there was another person joining those two angels. Now I have to be honest, I've always wondered, why on earth did Mary not recognize her son? It is one of the conundrums, one of the poignant questions that most of us perhaps face, especially in the post-resurrection stories. Why didn't the disciples recognize Jesus when he was on the road to Emmaus? Why didn't they recognize the reality of who Jesus is? And I know that still remains a question for us. But the reality is that in the speaking of the person, Mary recognized Jesus. How many for us in a post-resurrection experience hear the voice of Jesus through those that we encounter on a day-to-day basis? How many of us, whilst we may appear in our own physical bodies, have the realization that when somebody speaks, it's almost as if God is speaking directly to us? I know over and over again, people come to me after we've preached or had worship on a Sunday and they say, "Were you in my head this week? How did you know that is absolutely what I needed to hear today?" Well, of course, we're very sophisticated these days, and when you come into church, we tag you. So that when you go home and you switch on your computers, we're able to know and see everything that you do. Well, perhaps not. Well, Brad thinks that would be disastrous. But how many of us have heard the voice of Jesus? Even when it may not be Jesus in the picture that we have so often of him, is not the person that we see. You see, I think on that Resurrection Sunday, Mary was hearing the voice of Jesus. And in that voice, there was evidence enough for her that Jesus had risen from the dead. In our sermon series throughout Lent, we've been speaking a lot about sin, the 7 deadly sins. and their virtues. But we've been speaking a lot about those deadly sins, those sins that we so often find ourselves trapped under because of the oppression and the systems that many of us have bought into. We have bought into the bad news of the world. And so often in those bad news, in that time when we don't feel so good about ourselves, we find ourselves acting out in ways that perhaps are not the best for us. And we've been wondering what those sins might be and how we can address those sins in our lives. On that Sunday, on that time of resurrection, what Mary heard was the voice no longer of doom and gloom, from sin to salvation. What Mary heard on that day was the voice of hope, was the voice of resurrection, was the voice that enabled her to transfer her life from a place of doom and gloom, but to a place of salvation, to a place of resurrection, to a place where she could have the opportunity to step up and to step out. She was given something new that day. And 2,000 years later, as we come to celebrate Easter Sunday, we too are given that good news opportunity to step out from ourselves, to step out from the places where we have perhaps fallen short, and to step into that new life of resurrection. To step from our own places of shortcomings or sin, whatever we want to call that, to a place of resurrection and to a place of salvation.